I'm just going to ask you probably one quick question, so just keep it short, just to give people an overview. Why don't we start with Jim, and tell us a bit about your collaborative project learning. So it was the first time you tried this, right? What kind of went well, what lessons did you learn?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, as Hugo says, it's the first time that we've tried to do a collaborative session around project design in the interface of peace building and tech. Maud Raw from Interpeace was working with me on the design of this session. We tried to keep it as simple as possible, given that we had 2 hours to plow through how to use technology for peace in specific contexts. I think what worked was that we knew that the Build Peace community comprised methodologists, technologists, practitioners, academics, and we had a whole variety of different perspectives and different kind of challenges that were put forward. By the end of the 2-hour session, we had some really great things that are going to be taken forward. I think the thing that didn't work is that we didn't plan in advance for how we would extend the experience over time beyond the end of the conference, and how we would help extend it beyond the 20 people or so who were in the room. And I think some of the ideas that we worked on, the challenges were quite exciting and might be of interest to you. Thankfully, one of the challenges that was worked on was how we can extend the conversations beyond this conference. So what we're hoping to do is use the solution from that to invite everyone in the conference to collaborate with us on the ideas we're taking forward. So watch this space and we'll see what comes out of it.
Great, thank you. Why don't we hear from Matthew now? Talk to us about evaluation methods. What were the kind of big takeaways from that session?
Well, we spent the first part of the session talking about the nature of the enterprise, and then the last part of the session in some small working groups where we tried focusing on a few case studies. We began by discussing a kind of a provocation that I offered to the group, which is that the very concept of monitoring and evaluation is potentially flawed in that that when one thinks about monitoring and evaluation, these are very adversarial terms that you tend to associate with organizations like, say, the NSA or your boss, and that if you're trying to effectively implement projects for the better of a community, it's important to develop a more collaborative and adaptive approach. And so I offered the concept of learning and adaptation as perhaps being more constructive for working through projects of this kind. And then we focused some on what we're really trying to evaluate and the range of outcomes that we may be looking for. For example, attitudinal change, building empathy, better communication both vertically between the local and international levels, horizontal communication within and among conflict communities, but then also the question of how does communication really build relationships and build institutions that can really serve as enduring alternative infrastructures for peace. Then we spent a little bit of time on some specific case studies in which people walked through the question of how to better. Am I breaking up here?
That might's terrible.
Okay, sorry about that. Is this better? Okay, I'm sorry. Have you heard what I've just said? Okay, I'm going to start again. So we looked at a few case studies. One had to do with preventing sexual harassment in Cairo. Another had to do with promoting reconciliation and national dialogue in northern Mali. And the third had to do with preventing violence by football fans in the English Premier League. This perhaps close to home for some people. But anyway, but the question that we were really posing is, you start with acting. Obviously you want to start with thinking about what's the problem, thinking about a theory of change, but ultimately you don't start to learn until you start doing. And you need to be learning as much from your failures as from your successes, but that means you also need to be adapting rapidly. And so we wanted to walk through the question of what are we looking to learn? How are we alert to potential unintended consequences, to perhaps incorrect or incomplete theories of change? And how are we thinking in advance how we might adapt as conditions change on the ground?
I think we're going to adapt rapidly now and switch over to peace data analysis for a second. Since you can see some names behind, it'll help you remember what he's talking about.
So a few of the key lessons learned in my comments. So the first lessons learned has nothing to do with data, it has to do with the fact that you should not moderate a panel that has your wife on it. She's not going to listen to your instructions. So in terms of key lessons learned, I mean, few of us enter the field of peace building with the goal of doing statistics or looking at numbers. I mean, it's not one of the common goals. But what really the panel showed was how important and useful it is. We had three different speakers with very different approach. One, the first one was looking at big data, which we started big data, the Data Pop Alliance. This was a group from the Leiden University. Not with outlandish claim around what big data can do, but very concrete examples of how simply mapping social networks, so Twitter networks, allows you to understand who to target when you do advocacy, for example. So concrete example, not necessarily big claims around what big data can do, but concrete aspects of that. The second presentation was looking at measurement and methods around defining complex concepts. How do you measure reconciliation? How do you measure social cohesion? The idea is simply to show that simple methods, simple design approach allow you to better quantify these elements. Now, quantification is important because, of course, you want to measure change over time. And I think with the third presentation, what all came together is the idea that when we talk about monitoring and evaluation, great. You know your project to empower women to do this worked. You know that small project to train teacher on education around conflict worked. Did we progress towards peace as a community? Did the overall situation improve? And so that's what one of the common elements when we were looking at broader data, at non-intervention related data, is to try to understand how a community is doing and where it's going to go in the future. And so we looked at a number of practical examples on how to do that, from the social media part to digital data collection. And I think the point of digital data collection is also to hammer that there are many low-hanging fruits. The number of organizations that still rely on paper, pen, things that have bottlenecks that take a lot more time so that the data can be made accessible, the number of PDFs that are out there, static maps that are out there that are not really conducive to analysis, interpretation, integration with multiple streams of data is a major issue. And let's remember the number of organizations that are not connected to internet in the field, that don't have computers, that don't have, these are the first responders, these are the guys that are there on the ground. So we need to target those low-hanging fruits about digitalization, equipment, connectivity, so that people can be better engaged.
Thank you, that's a fantastic lesson. Now, Derek, we had fun, didn't we, in the games session. What was sort of the most surprising thing, do you think, that came out of that, or what was like the best idea that you had?
Well, I have to say, I was delighted with how much a room full of peace builders started to think like a room full of game designers. It's not that often in our field that we can step away from our complex theories of change and our very hierarchical methodologies of how things happen in the world and start thinking in simplistic ways about how to engage people. And I think whether you're making games or not inside this field, that's a fundamental question that we all need to be able to answer. So for the record, I just tweeted out before getting up here my presentation from my working session. So if any of you weren't able to attend, you're welcome to check it out online for free. Also my notes, and I'm more than happy to talk about games with everybody here.
Awesome, thanks so much. Tessa, you think about the future, so what did you learn in your session?
I think it might be more interesting if I could put someone who participated on the spot. Are there any volunteers who want to talk about what you learned from the session, what we did? Any of you brave enough?
So if
No?
we're
Okay.
on this side, it's highly want to participate, and on this side,
So yeah, we explored the process of thinking about the future, some of the actual, the reasons why we think about the future in order to understand the process of change. And we tried to look at the really big picture of what's happening with social technologies and what's the systemic change that's actually underfoot. And tried to explore how is this affecting some of our governance issues, how is it affecting the future of social change. And then we explored some scenarios, and I think we had some really interesting discussions about, what are the directions of change that we want to pursue, which are the ones that we don't want to pursue, and why.
Great, thank you. Now, Adam, tell us about the media and polarization section. This was one of my favorites, actually, personal favorites of the conference. What were kind of the problems we were contending with, and did we come to any solutions, you think?
One of the challenges that we as a group presented was this notion that polarization appears to be inevitable as media fragments. There's more media out there. And that people get to ever tailor their specific preferences to the media that they can watch and kind of self-enforce that which they believe within a context that works for them in the media environment in which they live. We explored some big data, thanks to Jonathan, some big data trends that indicated that this was in fact the case, and that while the middle of a bell curve depicting polarization was in fact flattening, there was still it was not to a degree that it was becoming a single horizontal line. There was still a moderate middle that was thinking about things in something less than a completely polarized sense. We then weighed in, Ivan then weighed in and kind of looked at some of the normative foundations around that work and what it meant in terms of large challenges of supporting media in spaces where this polarization exists. And then we opened it up to the field. And to be perfectly frank, as a donor, as somebody who works in media that is ever more fragmented, I'm probably consider myself a cynical realist in the space. There's media I have to work with, there's things that I have to contend with, and you try to muddle through and do as well as you can. But to be frank, I wasn't expecting our conversation to go the direction it did. Kudos to this group. You are those that envision a brighter, more positive future. By the end of the conversation, we had moved out of a realm of polarization as a uniquely negative space and into a realm where the ever more plural discussions in a society are possibly a vector for more social change and for more collaboration and for more interest. And we started to look at some models of polarized societies that are able to negotiate that polarization without resorting to conflict. So, thank you.
Cecil just wanted to add something.
I did forget the most interesting discovery. So we began with the exercise to look at whether or not you feel the future is going to be good or it's going to be bad, and whether or not you think you can affect the future or not. And normally when I do this with groups, it's pretty split. And depending on the circumstance, if you're in a place of conflict, it's usually very negative. But in this group, 100% of the people were in the can make the future what I want it to be. We can affect the future. And that's a first for me. So that's, that's to you guys as peace builders that you have that perspective. That's amazing.
Thanks. So optimistic. Now finally, Michaela, tell us about the Build Peace Lab. And for people who are like, hang on, what was that again? Give us a bit of background.
Yeah, we decided to try it this year and see if we could really activate a community to help incubate projects and ideas in order to increase the chance that they would be successful once they got up and running. And I have to say, at the end of 2 Build Peace Lab sessions, I asked everybody to raise their hands, do you want us to do this next year? And every single person raised their hand and said, yes, please. So we had a really great group, and I would say 2 kind of really exciting things popped out for me. I'm sure the group would have many other insights that they could share. But one is that it became really clear that we saw similar emerging lessons from very, very different frameworks. So for example, we had Claudia from Hacer las Paces in Colombia, whose work is deeply rooted in neuroscience research. And at the same time, Ali Gohar from Just Peace Initiatives in Pakistan, who's really working from a grassroots framework about a historical culture and religious and judicial systems that are very, very deeply rooted. And both of them were targeting changing the discourse and changing narratives, engaging grassroots populations and activating them for more sustainable transformation. So I thought it's so exciting to see that we can come from these very, very different angles as a community, and we see the same lessons and the same objectives emerging in so many synergies. So that was the first one. And the second was, of course, it was really exciting to have technologists and peace builders in the room, and especially the opportunity to ground truth some of the approaches that we're seeing or some of the ideas that we have in the local realities on the ground. So to illustrate that, we had Marianne from Peace Superheroes, who was sharing a really exciting game targeting young people in the United States to kind of shift their attitudes towards conflict and how they could be activated as peace actors and to really instill those values in them. And then we had Maged from Egypt, who very just, in a very direct way raised his hand and said, we don't need peace superheroes in Egypt. We need the common population taking responsibility and engaging as peace builders. And there was a really great exchange about how that type of gaming platform targeting young people could be adapted for an Egyptian reality. So those are just two quick snippets. I would say, again, echoing Jim, watch this space. Those of you who are incubating ideas, I think this is something we'll definitely continue toward the future, and just encourage everyone to begin to see this really as a community that we can rely on to help one another make sure that we are taking steps forward in a thoughtful way, in a strategic way, and really drawing on one another's expertise. So thanks everyone for participating in the labs.